Hi, I'm Sheila Kuehl. Welcome to Get Used to It. Glad you're back with us for another episode. Today we're very, very fortunate to have as our guest John D'Amelio, who is a writer and historian about our community, about our history, internationally published, probably the best known historian, although I'm sure there are some others that might vie for the title. Certainly my favorite historian, and a man of really fine intellect. And I think great acuity in terms of helping us figure out what's going on these days in terms of our community being suddenly in the middle of the griddle, at everybody's attention, and many of us without a great deal of knowledge about our own history as a community. John has published several books, two of which I'll tell you about later. But John, very, very happy you're here.
I'm glad to be here too,
You had a long
Sheila.
plane ride and a long drive, and here
yes.
you are.
But I made it.
Yes, and I'm so glad you did. We are a community often without much sense of our own history, though I have a hunch that many people watching the show would have read your name and said, "Gee, I think I read an article, wasn't there something in this publication?" Review of other people's books I know you've done. How did you start out, though? One isn't born an historian.
Right.
Think of little boys going, "Gee, I think I want to be an historian when I grow up."
Yeah, no, actually I wanted to be a priest when I grew up, but,
Oops,
but things got in the way. Yes.
Really?
No, well, you know, I went to college in the 60s. I grew up in New York City. I was at Columbia during the height of all of the protests in the 60s, the war, you know, Black Pride, Black Power. And there was something about those times that were really tremendous. And I was very involved in anti-war stuff. And I went to graduate school in part because I didn't know anything about the history of this country somehow or another. Got through college, didn't know anything about U.S. history. And I figured that I couldn't make sense of what we had been going through if I didn't know some history. And so I became a graduate student just at the time that Stonewall, early gay liberation in New York was percolating and erupting all over the place. And at some point early on in my graduate school career, my life intersected with gay liberation. And it did it in a way that involved other men and women who were either university professors or graduate students like myself or librarians. And we came together with the sense that it must be possible to use the skills, the intellectual skills of the academy to further the liberation of gay men and lesbians. And those early meetings of what was called the Gay Academic Union back then were so exciting. It was like the world just opened up in a completely new way, and I knew that everything that I was learning as a historian, somehow or another, I was going to turn to understanding the gay liberation movement and the struggles of gay people for freedom better.
What do you learn as an historian? I think before we talk about the content, I think it's kind of interesting to try to understand. It seems to so many of us that history is written by the winners, and so we learn something, you know, K through 12, then we go to college and we kind of unlearn it because it turns out that the Civil War was fought for an entirely different reason than the one we had been told, you know, in our little big print history books. What does it mean to write history?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, history, people fight over history. You know, people fight over the meaning of the Confederacy. They fight over the Enola Gay and the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. For me, history is about two things. One is that whatever you're studying, history is a story of change. You know, that is, like, for me, the single most important truth of history. And for me, as a gay teenager kind of coming to struggle over all of this that was happening to me, knowing that the world changed was a really important thing to know, because if things changed, it might not always be the way it was for me right now. So, I mean, that's actually the birth of my love of history. It's just knowing that if you study history, you're really reading about things that are different than the present, which means the future can be different from the present as well. I think for gay men and lesbians especially, because we don't grow up in a gay and lesbian community and a gay and lesbian culture, history has another kind of special meaning. We can look to history for the memory that our families don't give us. And you know, even before some of us started writing gay and lesbian history in the 70s and 80s, there was an oral history tradition within our community. You know, when younger men and women came out, the generation before them would tell them stories about what it was like for them, and that's a kind of history. But what some of us have been doing over the last 20 years, and at an accelerating rate, is really devoting ourselves to uncovering a history. And it's a history that can be inspiring. It's also a history that can be disturbing. It's a history that's complicated. It's not a simple story of, you know, great heroes like the people you have, you know, here. It's, you know, it's interesting, and I think it's vital for our community's future.
So here you are in the 60s, and we're in a time when we were kind of rejecting other people's, what we had been told, a lot about history, which was also telling us what America was, and we were being told love it or leave it, mostly leave it, because, or line them up against the wall and we'll shoot them because they're saying things different than what we want to hear. You're in the middle of discovering that there is a group of people interested in this. Gay liberation is beginning. My impression of history is that you write something that you've concluded about. Was it possible in the middle of the beginning of something to write about it, or did you have to look pre-Stonewall in order to begin to conclude about your life in post-Stonewall?
Right. God, you ask good questions.
That's why they pay me the big bucks.
That's why you're here.
I assure you, they don't pay me anything to do.
Well, the interesting thing about doing gay history in the 70s when I started, and I consider myself very fortunate to have started when I did, is that we didn't know any. And so we had preconceptions. We had a lot of mythologies, actually, in the early 70s about gay history. And the mythology was that it's only a story of oppression, and there isn't much history back there to find. You know, and I and, you know, other folks like Jonathan Katz and Joan Nessel and Alan Barabee, I mean, we knew that this couldn't be true, that there had to be a history back there to be found. And what I was particularly interested in, I wasn't going to do the whole shebang. Here I was involved in gay liberation. The common wisdom was that a bunch of drag queens rioted in Greenwich Village in June of 1969, and out of nothing, gay liberation. And something told me that that couldn't be the whole story. I mean, movements do not just spring into existence out of nothing overnight. And so I went in search of what happened before Stonewall. Now, I'll have to admit to you that when I went in search of what happened before Stonewall, I didn't actually think that enough had happened before Stonewall for it to be a whole book. It was just going to be part of a book, and then I would go the rest of the way from Stonewall to the present. But the excitement of doing this research was to realize, oh my God, there is a whole story to be told that has an integrity completely its own about what happened before Stonewall. And I'm actually only going to tell part of it. I can't tell the whole history. I will just tell one piece of what happened before Stonewall.
And what piece did you choose to tell or talk about?
I told the piece that was about those gay men and lesbians who said, we need to organize in order to make change. We need to form organizations, reach out to a public, and in whatever ways we can, challenge the prejudices, the oppression, the discrimination, the lies that are everywhere about us. So it's really the pioneering generation of gay and lesbian activists that I went in search of.
And your conclusion then about sort of post-Stonewall, I mean, is that a real dividing point for us? Or, I mean, symbolically it is, certainly. And I know that people feel there began to be more organizing, more understanding of the commonality of issues, although it took women and men a little bit of time, I think, to see that commonality.
Yeah. You know, it's very funny. I mean, I wrote the book, by the time I had done the research, I wrote the book for the purpose of saying the short theme would be, it didn't start with Stonewall, okay? But because I stopped the book with Stonewall, there's a way that unintentionally you can read the book and still come out of it and think, well, there is a pre-Stonewall history, but then Stonewall happens, and that's when the real stuff gets going. And I actually don't think that's true. I think Stonewall was an eruption, and after Stonewall, something is very different, but after Stonewall, many things are still the same. That there's a continuity from the early 60s into the 70s, even as there are certain kinds of breaks that Stonewall and gay liberation, lesbian feminism create.
You have used a phrase, leaping and creeping, talking about movements. Tell about that.
Well, you know, we have 50 years now of gay and lesbian politics in the United States. It's most people don't realize, but that's pretty amazing. I mean, that's a long enough period of time now to actually speculate about patterns. And one of the things, if I look at the story from the late 40s, when things are just getting started, through now the late 90s, half a century later, it's very clear that the pace of change and the way change occurs is not uniform. That independent of what people might like to have happen, you can see an alternating cycle in terms of the growth of a gay and lesbian movement and of social change around gay and lesbian issues of leaping and creeping. We have these short periods where things come together the way they did around Stonewall, the way they did in the late 80s because of AIDS and ACT UP and the March on Washington and things like that, when in a very short period of time the world seems to change. You know, you wake up and things are different. And then in between, and that's really dramatic and it's exciting and some of us live for those moments, right? But in between, there are longer stretches in which not much seems to be happening, in which we are just creeping along, and it's a lot of boring, tedious work that isn't dramatic at all. And the two things have a close relationship to one another. I mean, how you creep has an effect on what kind of leap you'll be able to take when the right moment is there. So, and you can't force, I don't think you can force a leap into existence, but...
Well, it's sort of like, I was thinking of pole vaulting for some reason when you were talking, how you have to get the footwork just right on the way, though that's not exactly creeping because one is running, but still, to get that at exactly the right place to take off. And that was, I don't know, the image that came to mind.
I understand, and then you kind of just leap and something big happens.
It's also, I mean, I'm also interested in the intersection between our history and what I guess I would call, without much knowledge, American history. And actually this is a question I didn't ask you when we were talking before, but David Garrow wrote, who wrote the biography of Martin Luther King, and I think won the Pulitzer Prize for it, wrote, his next book was called Liberty and Sexuality.
Right.
And one of the things, although it was a giant mosaic of things which I didn't see a real editorial voice in, just presented to let you come to your own conclusions about stuff. But one of the things that struck me was that it seemed as though until 3 institutions in America start taking up a more balanced notion of a community, things do not move forward. And of course, in his book, as many have, he was drawing a line along the anti-contraception, pro-contraception, anti-choice, pro-choice, and then a little bit, our community, the non-reproductive sex line, rather than the equality and civil rights line. But it seemed like until the press, the pulpit, and the law begin to reflect a little more of our point of view, that you don't see a great sea change in public opinion. And I assume that you would say we have seen a great change in public opinion.
Well,
what would you attribute?
I mean, talking about leaping and creeping, actually, public opinion is one area in which the shifts have tended to be very slow, and it's a kind of slow accretion of change. And there may be a moment in time where the poles just change, because, like a gaze in the military story or something like that. But actually, that isn't permanent. It's a slow accretion of change. I think the way public attitudes have changed over the last generation is that there is more of a willingness to live and let live around gay and lesbian people. And people shouldn't be penalized for the way they are. There isn't a next step of welcoming and embracing. Now, I don't know if we'll ever get to the welcoming and embracing stage. I'm sure we will, actually. I don't know when it'll be. But that kind of shift does not seem to have occurred. There are pockets of people, you know, where there's more dramatic change. But on the other hand, if you think about what life was like during the McCarthy era in this country, when there were active persecutions all the time by the full force of the government, the notion that lots of Americans now think, live and let live, this is their business, that's a pretty big change.
And it's also very threatening. I guess depending on whether people are watching this show in its first run or in a rerun, we are either having a current situation in Washington or one that has been resolved, and we don't know at this moment when we're making the show kind of what will happen. But one thing that struck me, John, about this whole brouhaha about the president, and in the larger sense, the notion that the right wing has tried to lay out for the country to buy, relates to simply defining morality as what sexual behavior you engage in, period. And, you know, like a magician saying, please only look at this hand while I'm over here in other things that others might call morality or immorality, having to do with, you know, hungry children, or the split between poverty and riches, or how we treat people in the country. It seems to me they've really tried to focus in, and that our community has been a major target, and I think a somewhat useful tool for them in terms of saying, let's focus on this, they're immoral because we say they're immoral because they're about sex, and the way they do it is immoral. And that's the intersection with American history I'm also thinking about. We are pretty much defined by our sexual behavior, aren't we?
It depends who's doing the defining, actually. That's a really complicated question.
Yeah, I know. But we've got time. Unpack
it. I think, well, there's a rabid anti-gay social group out there that's often associated with fundamentalist religion, although it's not entirely that, that defines us entirely by our sexual behavior. And that defines that sexual behavior as immoral and threatening and subversive of all that is good and necessary in a healthy society and a moral society. I actually don't think, I don't know how anyone would even know this, but I don't think most gay men and lesbians primarily identify themselves by their sexuality. It's more complicated than that. It's like sex is caught into a much larger framework of affection and intimacy and love and the relationships that constitute our family in the broadest sense of the word. It also has something to do with gender and the fact that we, you know, because we're same-sex couples rather than opposite-sex couples, a lot of us, but not all of us, have a different angle on gender. And you know, I mean, some of the best humor that comes out of our community from both men and women in the community is usually their ability to play with notions of gender. I think it's all those things together that help, you know, that define for ourselves what it is to be gay, and sex is a part of that, but it's one of the parts.
Well, in terms of them, I mean, that we define ourselves in some ways, and some ways we don't. We say, I will not be simply defined by this. Although I know that changes over time. When I was in working as a associate dean of students during the early days of the second wave of the women's movement, it became important to young women when someone would say, "Tell me 3 things that you are." They would start out by saying, "I'm a woman." And I know in my generation, if you had said when I was in college in the 50s, "Tell me 3 things you are," I would not have started out by saying I'm a woman. It was not a consciousness about gender, even though there was much more oppression in those days. I would say, you know, I'm whatever, my sorority, or I'm a Bruin, or, you know, I'm a English major, or things that would define me by what I did. And so we define ourselves, but then it seems to me that the tool used against us, I guess what I'm asking is, in their defining us only about sex and saying morality itself is only about sex, seems to me that they use us to serve a larger right-wing agenda.
Right. Well, that I would agree with entirely. I mean, one of the things that's, well, if we sidetrack to the other drama in America today, you know, the White House, Clinton, Congress, it's a wonderful example of something that is about sex and is not at all about sex. It's sex proved to be the Achilles heel of the man, but he was being targeted long before sex had anything to do with, you know, his presidency. And in a different way, I mean, we get targeted because our sexual behavior falls in that non-procreative, you know, non-responsible, non-reproductive vein. It seems, therefore, to be completely about sort of pleasure and self-absorption to those who attack us. It's those who are attacking us these days are claiming the Bible as their text that allows them to say what's wrong with who we are and what we do. It helps to whip up a fervor that has created kind of electoral majorities in not only Congress but in legislatures around the country and governors' mansions. But then, if you look at what this new conservative movement, it's not so new anymore, but this right wing has done, actually, much of what they've done has not been about gay and lesbian, because actually, over the last 25 years, even as their power has increased, it's become easier to be gay and lesbian. Mostly what they've done with the power that they've gathered, partly by attacking us, is to move the country more generally to the right, make the distribution of wealth worse, make this a country that's completely about market forces, that's about greed, and scapegoat lots of other people. Scapegoat single mothers, a sexual connection again, scapegoat immigrants. You know, if you look at some of the rhetoric about immigrants, it isn't about sex directly, but their children are milking the resources of the state. You know, they have too many babies. You know, that's what the right wing would sort of hint at. So sex weaves its way in and out of this conservative movement, whose achievements have often been about economics and about a more basic economic inequality. It's quite interesting, actually.
Well, I guess that's what I mean by the, you know, the watch this hand, because we're really talking about them and the yuck, the sort of high yuck factor that we have at this particular moment in time. And other problems or concerns have had a high yuck factor. I mean, even contraception. It was interesting to me to find out that the man in the Connecticut legislature in the late 19th century, who was responsible for drafting the first anti-contraception law, was P.T. Barnum.
Oh, you're kidding.
Who was elected to the Connecticut legislature and was the chair of the morality committee, temperance and morality, and thinking that temperance wasn't simply enough, he'd have to define morality as, again, having to do really with the control of reproduction, but also making certain that there was plenty of it. And of course, no one knew when he said a sucker is born every minute, he meant to make sure of it by banning contraception.
Right, no contraception, there will be lots of suckers born.
Exactly, and of course, and the first person to break that law in Connecticut was Katharine Hepburn's mother.
That
so
I know.
I think, you know, history, I know nothing but sort of cocktail party conversation, but the sort of the interesting piece of how things flow along and how your attention is focused in America on an issue, and then we'll move on. And I very much agree with what you said about the right wing.
And you know, I mean, one of the, actually, in terms of thinking about the history of sexuality, and specifically about us, but not just about gays and lesbians, I mean, one of the tragedies, I think, of the present moment, you know, that we're living through, is that the anti-sex, anti-gay, anti-feminist, all of this stuff has become, in the popular mind, across the spectrum, associated with religion. And if you look back in time, that hasn't always been true. For instance, in the 40s and 50s, when there was, you know, an intensification of homophobia and gay and lesbian oppression, it wasn't religion that was primarily perpetrating it. It was the government under the label of like national security and fears about subversion. It had no religious basis to it at all. There have been other periods in American history where religion actually has been the primary force moving us in the direction of progressive social change. In the decades before the Civil War, it was a religious impulse that led many people to the abolitionist crusade and other kinds of reform movements. And part of what is so offensive to me, both individually and as a historian who has a kind of this longer view, is how successfully a religious right wing has completely claimed the mantle of religious authority for themselves, and not religious authority in 1998 and 1999, but as if it's been for all eternity. And it just ain't true, you know?
Well, it's one of the interesting things about majority, about which I've learned a lot being in the legislature. You know, if, the law is what the majority says it is, not a, you don't need a unanimous verdict.
Right.
And they've managed to accrue a majority in so many churches, which has a very articulate minority on our side, whether it has to do with issues of our commitment ceremonies or marriages or our ordination in the various churches. So this is a thing then that we need to learn, I guess, from history, because if we focus too much on religious organizations and religion as the problem, isn't it true we may miss something? I mean, like, take the government for granted, they're the good guys or whatever.
And we may miss the capacity of religion to be a really progressive force in society, something that provides not simply a meaning that revolves around exclusion and hatred and anger and division, but religion is a force that actually has been very constructive in the lives of huge numbers of people, past and present. So, I mean, it's just, you know, I think we need to be open to a range of possibilities, and that's one of the things that history does for you, is it allows you to see times when it wasn't the way it is now.
Well, and also you can have the same two things, I'm sorry, two opposite things existing at the same time. When you're talking about the role of religion in civil rights, for instance, at the same time as you saw white pastors standing in the doors of their churches saying, you know, no blacks can come in, you saw others, black and white and all different communities, marching together for civil rights. Where was the moral authority of religion in the 60s?
Right.
It was in both places.
It was in both places. It was in both places. Although the place that was dynamic was the place that was arguing for social justice.
And it's the opposite
It's the
now.
opposite today. The place that's dynamic is the place that is speaking from a position of sort of hatred and social division.
And it's a matter of where the energy is. I mean, you're talking about history, as you said, history describes change. And that the impetus has been with the right wing, I think not because we stepped aside and let it necessarily, because we had a lot of energy and a lot of impetus as well. But it's interesting how a certain message will resonate and speak to people's sort of inchoate desires to have things just be good or feel good about things. So there may be some relationship even to people feeling that their lives are out of control, or, you know, that society is too complicated and needing to get back to this simple stuff.
Well, and that's, I mean, you know, that's part of, that was one of the outcomes of the 60s. I mean, for me, what the 60s was about was the world cracking open and just seeing like a range of possibilities that I never knew existed, and being excited about a new sense of community and forward movement. For many other people, clearly what the Americans, what the 1960s was about was their world and everything they believed in being challenged. Racial hierarchies were challenged, their sense of patriotism, my country right or wrong, was challenged, and then people were challenging family, gender, sex, hippies living in communes. I mean, there was no secure base, nothing that you could turn to. And it's out of, you know, while some of us were thinking, oh my God, you know, it's like the future is bright and like we can do anything, others were deciding that something is really deeply wrong here and we're going to fix it our way. And, you know, from the mid-60s on, a conservative movement began growing in this country that paralleled, ironically, the growth of feminism, the growth of gay liberation, shifts in the structure of race relations in the U.S.
And it was interesting to me, I think I heard you say earlier in talking about the attacks on the president being more and earlier and different than the current attack, which had to do with sex. It seemed to me you tied that in a way. That is, though he's not the quintessential child of the 60s, he did challenge those same sorts of concerns, and that must have made him a real focal point for the right wing.
He symbolizes to the right everything about the 60s. You know, it's like, did he or didn't he inhale? You know, was he a draft dodger? His wife is a powerful woman who's a career woman. All of the things, he likes he's a Southern white guy who is comfortable in the presence of African Americans. You know, he's done everything wrong as far as this older view of what the proper social order should be. Now, the irony of this is that, you know, this is my personal politics coming out. I mean, he's not exactly the most liberal president, you know, of the last, of the Democratic Party's tradition, but he symbolizes all those things, and the hatred, the hate-driven venom of a right-wing social movement has completely attached itself to this man. I mean, it's an amazing thing to behold.
Well, it's interesting how much we have in common with other sort of hated groups or persons, which always makes me feel very strong. I like looking around going, oh, they hit you too?
Yeah.
You know, here we are, because everyone who is, it's sort of like what's happened in California politically. I mean, we just swept the elections on the Democratic side in 1998, partly because one by one, every growing, new, or gaining power kind of minority had been alienated by the other side with some kind of wedge issue. And when you take this community that's been alienated, then this one, and then this one, and this one, though they may not see themselves as unified, you tend to be able to say, I'm not going with them. They're against me. I'll stick with them. They're not as bad, or whatever. And that's really what happened with us. And the gay community has become more politically acute, and certainly more politically active. At least that's what I think. I mean, I may be quite mistaken about our history, about which I know about as little as most regular people, except that I've now read your books, so I'm much more informed. But
yeah, I mean, I don't know, politically, well, why do you think that, when you say you think that we're much more politically aware or politically active, how do you measure that, or what makes you want to say that?
Well, I guess as an elected person, it's important to me that people know that the government has power over their lives in a way that matters, in a way that they should think about. And the second thing I like people to know is that there's no such thing as the government. That in a democracy like ours, the government's a set of empty chairs. And every time you have an election, whether you go to the polls or not, somebody sits in those chairs. And it makes a difference in terms of agenda and in terms of our lives. Can we adopt or not adopt? Can we complain if we're discriminated against or not? Can we keep our job or not? Is AIDS important and funded or not? That all depends on who's in the chairs. And our community, to a great extent, has sort of donned awakened to that notion and said, gee, maybe I should be involved in electoral politics, which grew very much out of our movement politics, which were kind of anti-electoral,
right.
like many
One of the
grassroots movements.
Yeah.
Do you disagree?
No, I don't disagree, actually. And although what I was, to jump back several minutes to an earlier part of the conversation, the leaping and creeping part, what I realized was going on in my brain as you were talking is that I was falling into the pattern, the leaping and creeping, opposition that I try to correct in other people, that it's okay, when we're creeping along, good things are happening. Because I think we're creeping now. I mean, around gay and lesbian issues, we're not making a great leap forward. I mean, there's too much strong opposition, and the country, the mood, the political structure is conservative enough that there are no great breakthroughs. But I think you're right, that there is more political awareness and activity. A lot of it is operating below what I would call the radar screen of history right now. It's happening in local communities through anti-violence projects, through community centers that are growing, in workplaces and things like that, and through individual political campaigns of local elected officials. There's, and every once in a while, even in this period of time, an event like the Matthew Shepard slaying will rouse people, but then people just creep forward for a while. But the creeping is good. Something important is happening right now. And I think what it is that we are, in a way that wasn't true in the 70s and 80s, in more and more parts of American life, we're integrating ourselves into how the institutions and practices of everyday life function. We're present and visible in the workplace. We are in schools. We're in the political parties, including the Republican Party.
Right.
And that's a different basis for making change, to not be only on the outside and separate, but to have kind of wormed our way or worked our way in or been in and decided to come out, which,
well,
is a fast way.
It leads to that question about assimilation. Because I sort of have two trains of thought, and I hope you'll help me get back to the train I'm not pursuing at the moment, which had to do with what difference it makes if we are defined only as sexual beings, and whether that we should choose to be or not to be. I want to get back to that. But in terms of, now I've completely lost my thoughts.
Assimilation.
Assimilation. Thank you. I'm so glad
I wouldn't forget that.
See, I'm so glad I said the word. As we become more integrated in regular old American life, and we're out, the next step for people often is a choice that I assume our community didn't have back when we didn't come out because we could get beaten up or killed just for doing that, all of us. We decide, are we going to be a gay or lesbian person? People will know us that way. When I was elected, it was lesbian elected to assembly, period. Or are we going to be a whatever, doctor or lawyer or whatever, who just happens to be gay and would prefer that not to be such a part of us? Are we taking in the values around us? Or, and I was thinking as you were talking, are we impacting the values of America ourselves from our community? Are they learning anything from us?
Well, oh God, there's so much I could say about this.
Good, please do.
Okay, well, first of all, we've already taken in the values of the culture. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about being gay, is that each of us grew up within the values of the culture, and for whatever reason, and nobody knows why, each of us individually found ourselves in some important ways at odds or feeling different. But the values of the culture are not foreign and external to us. We actually know them very well. And part of what becoming gay has been about for many of us, I think, is affirming a sense of difference and then trying to figure out what that means. Because there are, I'm sure you feel this too, as in Sacramento or at home in Santa Monica, there are moments, there may even be hours and days in your life when what you are is a lesbian. You know, there are days when I know that what I am is a gay man. It's something happens out usually it's something that happens out there that makes me dramatically aware of it. And then much of my time I just go around being John, you know, and it's, okay. Now the assimilation issue. Well, if integration and assimilation I don't think are the same thing, you know, it's like, assimilation to me implies a kind of wiping out, you know, you just sort of vanish somehow or another. And that can't be the equivalent of integration, which for me integration means full access. You know, there's no place from which you are excluded. You can move in and out of everything that the society has to offer. So it has to be possible, at least for me, to hold on to an ideal in terms of my values of integration, that this is a really good thing, and this actually is a route by which one unravels oppression, at the same time that it doesn't mean that one completely vanishes as a gay person, a gay community, a gay movement, a gay people. And it's also, you know, I don't think anybody calls themselves an assimilationist. Have you ever known somebody who has said, I'm an assimilationist?
No, there's always a not in the sentence.
Yeah, I'm
not an assimilationist.
Right. And assimilation is something that's only, that you accuse somebody of. Nobody ever embraces it. So I even wonder if assimilation is an invention, you know, like a figment of some of our imaginations by which we express what we're most afraid of.
Well, let's take the Italian community. Are they assimilated or not? Because in my parents' generation, which was early in this century, living in St. Louis, there was the Italian section, there was the Jewish section, there was the black section, and they never crossed the line. My mother used to say, the Italians had light bulbs, the Jews had gas lamps, and the blacks had candles. And that, you know, was a level of, they were all poor. But now, people rarely define themselves as Italian Americans. We rarely think of identifying you, John, first of all, as an Italian. Do you say that?
Well, now that's a really good question. I mean, there are just, it's not as dramatic as being gay, but anymore. But when I lived in North Carolina, I was often aware that I was Italian because nobody could pronounce or spell my name. You know, when I was in New York as a child and adolescent, I was really aware that I was Italian because we still had ethnic wars in my neighborhood. But then it sort of vanishes in the cosmopolitan culture of Manhattan or something, or in the sort of the culture of the academy. But, you know, there's a way in which I'm still Italian. And a year ago, when I went to my aunt's funeral in Brooklyn, and like 65 of us were in the funeral home, we were very Italian. And if a WASP, I don't know if that's derogatory, maybe I shouldn't say that, if a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant from North Carolina had walked into that funeral home, they would have known that they were walking into a cultural group that was different from themselves.
But it's not a difference that makes a difference as much anymore. And
no,
it's not a matter of oppression.
It's not an identity around which oppression functions very much.
So is that a loss?
The loss of oppression? That's great.
No, I'm sorry. Is it a loss of culture? I guess I'm thinking, because you have said there may come a time when people will know I'm gay, but it honestly won't matter as much, or hardly at all. And I'm thinking about Western European differences in days when it really made a difference. No Irish need apply here, you can't work in this place, like that. And these were very strong images to past generations. And now it's moved on to other oppressions,
Yeah.
not as much. Is that a great loss,
Well,
do you know what I mean,
actually,
to the community?
Yeah, this is really interesting. There is a little bit of a loss there. This is another kind of big historical question, too. I mean, my grandparents, who were Italian immigrants at the early part of the 20th century, they came at the tail end of the massive waves of immigration that occurred before immigration restriction. And therefore, my parents' generation, and then the grandchildren's generation, mine, increasingly came of age at a time when there were fewer and fewer immigrants coming into the country, and the pressure for Americanism and for vanishing into the woodwork of America was very, very high. One of the things that's interesting about, to me anyway, about living through a new generation era of large-scale immigration in the United States is to notice that if we can figure it out, because this is the era of multiculturalism in a way that the 20s and the 30s and the 40s were not, maybe this generation of immigrants can sort of figure out how not to lose the richness of their culture in a way that the richness of many of those, say, Mediterranean, Eastern European cultures really got lost in the United States in the course of the 20th century.
Well, we were going to try a little bit with bilingualism.
Yeah.
And to some extent it was trying to get the children where they were and bring them along in their own language and teach English. But still, there is also this sense of it. And I don't know if it translates perfectly for our community because, again, this other branch that I wanted to explore, people have said, you know, maybe we need to downplay the sexual nature of our community. Let's not hold hands in public. Let's not make people uncomfortable by appearing to even remind people that we might be sexual with each other. And yet, it is the thing that we have thought of that differentiates us, and somehow it is a part of our identity.
Yeah. Well, but it's not even apart from whether it's the thing that really differentiates us and it's at the core of who we think we are. You know, I don't even consider myself a militant on this issue, but like holding hands in public is part of the sort of the cultural norm. You should be, you know, it's the way people express affection. They kiss each other in public. Representations of heterosexuality are everywhere in the popular culture. And I'm not even talking about pornography. I'm talking about ordinary movies and TV shows where we don't, I think many people who watch TV and Hollywood movies don't even think of what they're looking at as heterosexuality. They think of it as life. Well, that has to become accessible to us, because to the degree that it doesn't become accessible to us, we're being denied something that the culture as a whole says is an essential part of being human. So if downplaying the sexual part of us means losing that, no. I mean, it's just, it's wrong. It's wrong, and it's painful. That's different from, although I don't know what the difference is, that's different from putting it in everybody's face all the time. But I don't know what I mean by that exactly.
Well, but the other thing is, we've claimed that part of what we have to teach America is to, you know, lighten up about sex and about sexuality and it's fun. And I mean, the joke was, of course, that's what the men had to teach, a little, you know, about being camp and great, really enjoying sex and lightening up about it, telling lesbians, you ought to try this, you know, it's really sort of fun, and lesbians saying, no, you know, political organizing is important, and suddenly we have political organizing about lightening up about sex, which probably turns out to be a good thing. But I want to, before our time is up, I want to talk about your work, and I brought a couple of examples because I really want you to talk to people about it, either of these here or any others, intimate matters and sexual communities.
Okay.
What led you to do this work, and what do you want us to take from it, aside from buying it?
Okay. To go back to the history thing, I mean, you know, I started doing gay history and the history of sexuality in the 70s. But part of the reason I was able to do that in the 70s was because people were doing all sorts of history that a generation earlier people didn't consider to be history. I mean, by the end of the 60s, history was no longer about kings, presidents, generals, war, and diplomacy. It was about factory life, it was about the family, it was about immigrant communities, it was about the slave community, it was about women in the home. I mean, history started to be about everything. And that generation, my generation of historians has, I know sometimes we doubt whether it matters, go to the Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., and you will see exhibits there, you know, about the experience of Japanese Americans during World War II, or about the migration of black Southerners to the North that would have never been there 30 years ago. And in time, our history is going to get there too. One of the things about, let me take sexual politics, sexual communities, because that was the first book, and there's a way in which it's still my favorite. You know, it's like when I look at it, I get very, very happy. What's interesting to me, a generation almost after doing the research, is to realize, and I think this goes back to something you touched on at the beginning, how much gay history is a part of American history. Like, it isn't this thing apart. For instance, you cannot understand the experience of gays and lesbians in the 20th century if you don't understand World War II and what World War II was like for Americans, because World War II dramatically affected being gay and being lesbian and what was possible for us.
In what way?
It completely disrupted the normal social patterns, statistically normal social patterns. You know, young people, men in terms of the armed forces, women primarily in terms of the civilian labor force, were ripped out of their towns and families and homes and neighborhoods and put in these same-sex environments. You know, it's like, I mean, one of the phrases that I use is that World War II was a nationwide coming out experience for a whole generation of gay men and lesbians. It was easier to find others and discover who you were. You can't understand gay and lesbian history if you don't know something about the McCarthy era and the amount of persecution and fear, sense of peril and danger and menace that was in the air in the United States during the 1950s. And you know, when you realize that, and then you can understand how it was we could be targeted the way we were in the 1950s. You can't understand Stonewall and gay liberation if you don't realize how important the 60s were in terms of, as I've used the phrase, but cracking open the world and saying anything is possible. It's even possible that gay people could be free. So, I mean, this is one of the, this wouldn't have been clear to me when I first started doing the research for this book and other stuff on the history of sexuality, but it's, you know, our history is the history of the nation. It's not a history that's apart and irrelevant.
We only have a few minutes left. I told you it was going to go by really quick. It went very
fast, right.
You just never know. What would you, if you were advising gay and lesbian young people, even in high school, about thinking about, if they're thinking that research or the academic life is possibly a good life for them, would you advise them to think about these areas of history, of sociology, of, I don't know, this is kind of cultural anthropology, and taking the risk of doing research about our community? I assume it's still a risk to go to your advisor and say, I'm going to write about gay people.
Yeah, I would advise, as I do, young folks who are thinking about a life as an intellectual or an academic and who want to do something that's going to mean something for gays and lesbians, to hold on to that dream and that intention and to be strategic and smart about how you do it, and to do it completely with your eyes open. Because there are no jobs advertised for gay historians. There are jobs advertised for 20th century U.S. historians. So you need to figure out, if you're going to do this work in history or anthropology or sociology or political science, you need to figure out how to do your work in a way that you're true to your deepest dreams and aspirations, but you're also not pressing the buttons that are going to, make everybody else around you crazy. Figure out how to do your work in a way that is good for gay people, but that also allows you to make the claim that you are within the mainstream of U.S. history or sociology or whatever.
John, thank you so much. This has been wonderful for
Great.
me. I do this show really for my own enjoyment, and I really hope you got something from it too. John D'Amelio has a number of books published. I think you should buy them all instantly because John, among others, has really taught us that our gay and lesbian community has our place and has been a big part of American history, and America should just get used to it. See you next time.